I'm delighted to be joined now by Wayne Scheggia from the Western Australian LGA. Wayne, welcome.
Thank you.
Wayne, can you briefly explain the effect of the global financial crisis on Australia?
I guess the opening comment I'd make is that the global financial crisis that occurred probably didn't impact Australia, and certainly didn't impact Western Australia in anywhere near the same way or to the same magnitude as it has the UK and particularly the US. Why is that? And I think I would have to give credit to probably 10 years of the previous government's fiscal effort in trying to develop a strong and stable economy, and that was demonstrated by the fact that there were a number of years of surplus budget outcomes for the nation. So that established in excess of $10 billion worth of accumulated reserves, which when the crisis hit, the government was able to utilise for its first stage of the stimulus package, as opposed to utilising debt, which was the mechanism that was used by most other, certainly European and the US government, to fund their stimulus. So Australia, for argument's sake, had such a strong economy in those 6 years leading up to the global financial crisis, where we had GDP running at around about 3.5%. When the crisis hit, that dropped down to 1.2%, but we were still in positive GDP. So we never actually technically hit recession, unlike the rest of the world. And I think Australia was the only country that didn't hit recession, certainly in the Western world. So a major credit to the previous government for that effort and the financial management that they imposed on the economy. Equally, debt was well under control within the Australian economy. About 17% of GDP was consumed by debt, whereas I think in the UK it got as high as 68.1% of GDP was debt. So quite a different scenario, a different set of circumstances, and probably makes the Australian experience of the actual crisis very different to the UK.
So what has been the impact on local government in Australia?
Well, it's interesting. There were positives and negatives, like any crisis, but I think that to think in terms of positives in a crisis is interesting, because the Australian economy was running warm, if not hot. We were actually experiencing some negatives from the high level of sustained growth, particularly in Western Australia, which is a resources-dependent economy, and with the significant resource effort that was going on, there was quite a strong pull away from local government in terms of the workforce. So engineers, planners, construction workers, all of these professions and jobs were being sucked into the resources sector and out of local government. So there was a mini employment crisis for local governments as a result of boom conditions prior to the GFC. So when the economy slowed, that actually returned some balance to the employment scenario in Western Australian local governments. So that was actually a positive outcome. There was certainly a levelling effect for salaries when the crisis hit. So when you're in a high growth scenario, there's competition for employees, so salaries tend to spike, and councils, always trying to play catch up against the private sector, made it very difficult for them to compete. So with the economy calming, councils were able to keep a lid on employment growth costs for their employees. So there are a couple of positives that came out of it. On the negative side, of course, when you have any sort of economic downturn, there's always losers in society as a result of that, and councils are always very conscious of the people that are at the bottom end of the economic food chain in terms of their service delivery. So the important pressures came on for keeping a lid on costs. It meant that rates and council associated taxes needed to be kept to a minimum, so councils weren't able to continue to expand programs as much as they would have liked.
So tell me, how has local government responded?
Local government was part of the national response, and most of that was driven through the stimulus package which the federal government implemented, and the major focus for local government within that was job creation around capital projects. So there wasn't an investment as such in expanded service delivery, but there was significant investment in capital projects, and local governments contributed to the maintenance of over 3,000 jobs within the building and construction sector, because as that closed down as a result of the financial downturn, capital projects and councils took up, And so there was a direct transfer from that private sector workforce back into the council workforce, which maintained employment in the economy. So that was a very important contribution that council made to the national recovery effort, and also, of course, it accelerated the development of council projects. And I guess that's a really important point for councils to be aware of, and where you can put yourself in a position to take advantage of crisis, was that councils in Western Australia, but nationally, had done a lot of work in strategic planning and project development planning for capital projects as a result of previous efforts that they'd made in terms of getting government funding projects up. So we had a stock or store of project ready works to go ahead with, and as a result, when the government said, here's the money, we need these things to be turned, within a very short time frame, local governments by and large were able to deliver.
So what's worked and what's been positive?
Well, I think from probably the most positive aspect has been the maintenance of that employment effort throughout the sector and in the economy. That's been really well. The attitude that the federal government took to funding local government was particularly important. It was a very simple, no strings attached process. Here's a cheque, you've got a project plan, put the two together and deliver it. Very minimal accountabilities, minimal red tape, and fast track action. And the councils, being able to respond in that way, delivered an outcome for the federal government which enhanced the relationship and gives us a strong basis to go forward in the future economy, perhaps net of any crisis. It's delivered a way of working that can be very successful. On the negative side, the federal government imposed some conditions around fast-tracking approvals for its own projects, which cut local governments out of what normally would have been an approval process that they would have contributed to. And there's a bit of a tendency in central government to want to hang on to now this newfound capacity to bypass local government's planning control mechanisms, and that's a danger for us. So trying to get that back into balance, where now that the crisis has passed, we need to return to an atmosphere where council's due process can be exerted over projects where there's no economic crisis to respond to.
So tell me what lessons you've learnt.
I think what was really critical for us was being project ready. So having our strategic planning at such a point where we knew well into the future what sort of capital works were needed to be done at the local level, what sort of service expansion was necessary, having those projects not just as ideas, but in terms of developed business plans, having them on the shelf ready to run. Now, being strategic is critical to being able to respond appropriately. What you don't want, I think, in trying to respond to financial crisis in particular, is any response. And I think a classic example of that was our federal government. One of their strategies for economic stimulus was simply to hand out cash, about $900 per person, to a great chunk of the Australian populace as a retail stimulus. And that became known as the Plasma for Pensioners scheme, because what happened was that most recipients went out and bought a new television set. I don't think those sort of efforts get appreciated in the long term as a good investment of tax dollars. The long-term public benefit doesn't exist in those. Having said that, it was an important retail stimulus, but it was a one-off, and once that money was spent, the stimulus effect was gone. And again, because a lot of retail goods are imported goods, perhaps it's arguable about where the benefit of that ultimately ended up, whether that was domestic or indeed overseas. So avoiding those sorts of pitfalls are important, I think, in the long term.
What advice would you give councils here in the UK?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I would say. Firstly, I wouldn't pretend to come into the UK or into a Solus environment and tell UK CEOs what to do, but the sorts of things I would do, for example, if I was a new CEO to local government in the UK, hearing the discussion that's been here today and over the last couple of days, I think it's really important that you take an attitude of being adaptive to the task. So relying on the way things have been done in the past is not going to provide a future in any context for UK local governments from what I can hear. So being adaptive, being quick to move, having plans in place and being willing to communicate and talk to people and actually be prepared not just to persuade people but to be persuaded by them. So having the capacity to listen well, understand an argument and bring some real interpretation of that to the table is important.